The courtroom was supposed to be a place of justice, a place where fairness prevailed, where arguments were weighed based on merit, not skin color. But on that day, it was anything but just. It was humiliating, degrading, a clear reminder that, even in the halls of power, racism didn't just exist. It thrived. The judge sat high above, looking down with disgust, his gavel tapping impatiently as if every second of her presence was an inconvenience. He barely glanced at the evidence. Barely let her speak. His eyes weren't on the case, weren't on the facts, they were on her. "What are you even doing here?" His voice slithered across the courtroom, dripping with disdain. "Women like you don't belong in places like this." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room, but no one spoke up. No one dared. The power was his. The final word, his. The law, his. She stood firm, her voice steady, refusing to show weakness. "I am here because justice should apply to everyone." He scoffed, shaking his head with a smug smile. "Justice," he repeated, as if the very idea was laughable. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Let me explain something to you, sweetheart. Justice is what I say it is." Then, in an act so brazen, so openly vile, he reached across the bench and snatched her purse. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The silence that followed was suffocating. She barely had time to react before he rummaged through her belongings, right there, in front of everyone. Pulling out papers, scattering them, tossing them aside as if her possessions were nothing more than trash in his courtroom. "What is this garbage?" he muttered, flipping through her notes. He sneered, waving them in the air. "You think this means something? You think this makes you important?" He tossed them onto the floor like they were worthless. Like she was worthless. Her hands clenched at her sides, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. Wouldn't let him see the fire raging inside her. But he wasn't done. Oh no, he wanted to break her. He turned to the bailiff with an exaggerated sigh. "Get her out of here. She's wasting my time." The bailiff hesitated, uncomfortable. Even he knew this had gone too far. But the judge wasn't a man to be challenged. "You heard me. Remove her." His voice boomed through the chamber, his arrogance unshaken. For a brief moment, she locked eyes with him. He smirked. Because to him, she was just another black woman daring to step into a space that he believed wasn't meant for her. She left without a word. Not because she was weak. Not because she had been defeated. But because she knew something he didn't. She knew who she was. And she knew exactly what was about to happen. The next time he saw her, the power dynamic would be different. Completely different. And this judge, this arrogant, racist man, the one who humiliated her so openly, so publicly, he would soon find himself begging. Begging for mercy. Begging for forgiveness. Begging for his life as he knew it. Because she wasn't just anyone. And he had no idea what was coming. Before we dive into this powerful story, we want to take a moment to say something important. Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism in any form. We believe in justice, respect, and equality for all. To our black viewers, your voice matters, your presence is powerful, and your stories deserve to be told with dignity and truth. Now, get ready for an intense and emotional story full of twists and justice. If you enjoy it, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support more stories that challenge injustice. Let's begin. The city hummed with the quiet intensity of a place where power was concentrated in the hands of the privileged. The courthouse, a towering monument of stone and glass, loomed over the streets like a symbol of authority, unshakable, immovable, untouchable. Inside its walls, decisions were made that shaped lives, crushed hopes, and dictated the boundaries of justice. It was here, in this very building, that Olivia Carter had spent years fighting to carve out a space where fairness could exist. But fairness, she had learned early on, was a luxury not afforded to everyone equally. Olivia had built her career on resilience. Growing up in a working-class black family in Chicago, she understood struggle intimately. Her mother, a nurse who worked double shifts to keep the family afloat, and her father, a former factory worker turned community activist, had instilled in her a deep sense of justice. Never let anyone silence you. Never let anyone tell you where you do and don't belong. Those words had carried her through law school, through every condescending remark from classmates who saw her as a diversity statistic rather than a competitor, through every moment of doubt when the system felt too vast and corrupt to change. By the time she stepped into the legal world, Olivia had learned that power didn't yield easily to those who weren't born with it. She had seen it in the way judges dismissed cases involving racial discrimination, in the way prosecutors built careers off the backs of the underprivileged, in the way justice was often reserved for those who could afford it. And yet, she pushed forward, becoming one of the most respected attorneys in civil rights litigation. She didn't just want to win cases, she wanted to change the system itself. It was that relentless drive that had brought her here today, standing in a courtroom presided over by Judge Richard Calloway. Calloway was the embodiment of everything she had fought against. A man who had been born into wealth and privilege, whose career had been shaped not by merit but by connections, whose judgments always seemed to tilt in favor of the powerful. He was a relic of an era that refused to die, a man who believed the courtroom was his kingdom and that those who entered it were subject to his personal whims. His reputation for hostility toward black attorneys was well known, though it was never spoken about in official circles. It was the kind of thing whispered about in hushed conversations, passed down as warnings to those who dared step before his bench. Olivia had seen his work firsthand, countless cases where he had dismissed clear evidence of racial bias, where he had belittled black defendants, where he had used his position to reinforce a system built to suppress rather than uplift. She had watched him smirk as he handed down harsh sentences to young black men while shaking hands with corporate lawyers defending billion-dollar companies from accountability. His decisions weren't based on law, they were based on prejudice, on the deep-seated belief that some people simply didn't deserve the same level of justice as others. Today, she was here to argue a case that should have been straightforward. A black business owner, illegally denied a loan by a bank that had systematically discriminated against applicants of color. The evidence was overwhelming: internal emails, statistical data, testimonies. Any unbiased judge would have seen it for what it was. But Olivia knew better than to expect fairness from Calloway. She knew that this case wasn't just about the client sitting beside her, it was about the message it sent. If she won, it would set a precedent, one that would open the doors for hundreds, maybe thousands, of similar cases. If she lost, it would reinforce the same cycle of power and oppression that had existed for generations. As she took her place at the plaintiff's table, she felt the weight of Calloway's gaze on her. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the armrest, sizing her up with the same dismissive smirk he had given every black attorney before her. He hadn't even looked at the case files yet, but Olivia could already see the decision forming in his mind. "This shouldn't take long," he muttered, loud enough for the courtroom to hear. There was a quiet murmur from the spectators, the kind of reaction that came when people knew injustice was about to unfold but felt powerless to stop it. Olivia remained composed, her expression unreadable, but inside, she was boiling. She had been here before, had seen this play out too many times. But today, something felt different. As she opened her briefcase, preparing to present her argument, Calloway suddenly leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "You know," he said slowly, his voice thick with condescension, "it never ceases to amaze me how people like you think you can waltz into this courtroom and expect special treatment." Olivia froze. The words were sharp, deliberate. He wasn't even trying to hide it. "I beg your pardon, Your Honor," she asked, keeping her voice steady. Calloway scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "You heard me. I've seen your kind before. Think the world owes you something just because you scream loud enough about injustice. Well, let me remind you, this is my courtroom. And I don't tolerate nonsense. A cold silence filled the room. Olivia's hands clenched at her sides. She could feel the eyes on her, spectators, attorneys, court staff, all watching, waiting to see if she would break. Then, in a move so audacious, so outright demeaning, he reached forward and grabbed her purse. The air in the room shifted. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Calloway turned it over, dumping its contents onto the desk in front of her. Papers scattered, pens rolled, her phone clattered against the polished wood. He smirked. "Let's see what kind of legal magic you're hiding in here." For a moment, Olivia couldn't breathe. Not because she was shocked, no, she had always known men like him existed. But because this was the moment. The moment when everything would change. She didn't react. Didn't reach for her things. Didn't let him see the anger burning inside her. Instead, she met his eyes, held his gaze, and smiled. It was the kind of smile that made people uneasy, the kind that carried knowledge the other person didn't have. Because Calloway thought he was humiliating her. Thought he was making an example of her. Thought he was untouchable. But he didn't know the truth. Didn't know who she really was. And by the time he found out, by the time he realized what he had just done, it would be far too late. The room was still tense, thick with the weight of what had just happened. Olivia sat motionless, watching as Calloway leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening as if he had already won. The papers he had carelessly tossed onto the table lay scattered like discarded evidence, a reflection of how little he thought of her work, of her very presence in his courtroom. A slow, deliberate breath filled Olivia's lungs. Not yet. She couldn't move too soon. Couldn't reveal too much. Calloway had power, for now. But power was fragile when placed in the wrong hands, and his grip on it was far weaker than he realized. The silence stretched between them. Then, he scoffed, shaking his head as if she were some naive fool who needed to be taught a lesson. "You really thought this case was going somewhere, didn't you?" His voice was laced with amusement. "I've seen a lot of desperate people come through my courtroom, but you take the cake. Fighting for a lost cause, acting like you belong here, tell me, does it ever get exhausting?" Olivia didn't flinch. "Justice doesn't get exhausting, Your Honor. Corruption does." A flicker of something unreadable crossed Calloway's face, but it vanished just as quickly as it came. He laughed. "Oh, I see what you're trying to do. You think if you keep up this whole righteous act, you can make me look like the villain in my own courtroom. Cute." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench. "Let me give you some advice. People like you don't win. You never have, and you never will. You might get a few sympathy cases, make a little noise, maybe even get some media attention. But in the end, the system was built to keep people like me in charge. You should have learned that by now." Olivia's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. Every word, every smug look, every ounce of his arrogance was fuel. She could feel the growing weight of every person in the room, attorneys, court staff, observers. Some looked away, pretending not to witness the blatant abuse of power. Others watched, faces tense, knowing they were witnessing something far bigger than just a legal dispute. She forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't here to argue with a man like Calloway. She was here to end him. Slowly, she gathered her papers, stacking them neatly, acting as if his insult had landed nowhere near her. She met his gaze with something that wasn't anger, but something far more dangerous, patience. "This isn't over, Your Honor," she said smoothly. Calloway let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, sweetheart, it was over before it even started." The gavel slammed against the wood, and just like that, the case was dismissed. The weight of injustice pressed down on the room, suffocating in absolute. Olivia exhaled, stood up, and without another word, gathered her belongings. She didn't argue. Didn't plead. She didn't need to. Because the game had only just begun. As she stepped out of the courtroom, she felt the eyes following her, whispers buzzing behind her back. She could hear her client's frustration, the murmurs of disbelief from those who had hoped for something different. But Olivia had no time to dwell. She had work to do. By the time she reached her office, she had already sent out the first call. The wheels had been set in motion weeks ago. What had happened today in that courtroom? It was nothing but the final straw. The last piece of evidence she needed to push forward with the investigation that had been quietly building. Calloway's record was a stain on the judiciary system, and Olivia wasn't the only one who saw it. There had been whispers, murmurs of cases dismissed under questionable circumstances, of backdoor deals made with corporate executives, of rulings that had left innocent people behind bars while the powerful walked free. Olivia had spent months digging through his cases, compiling evidence, reaching out to those who had been silenced. And now? Now, she had exactly what she needed. "Is everything ready?" she asked into the phone, her voice calm but sharp with precision. "More than ready," the voice on the other end responded. "The documents are filed. The ethics committee will be notified by morning. And the press?" A pause. "They're going to have a field day with this one." Olivia allowed herself the smallest of smiles. "Good." She ended the call, her mind already spinning ahead to what would happen next. The power Calloway had flaunted so freely today. By this time tomorrow, it would start crumbling beneath him. As the hours passed, the storm quietly gathered strength. The first headline appeared just before midnight, small, but damning. Allegations of judicial misconduct surface against Judge Calloway. By morning, it had spread like wildfire. Calloway woke up to chaos. His phone buzzed non-stop, messages flooding in from people he had once considered allies. He barely had time to register the first few before the calls started. "Richard, what the hell is this?" A furious voice blasted through the speaker. He rubbed his temple, still groggy. "What are you talking about? You haven't seen the news. Open your damn laptop." He sat up, heart pounding, fingers unsteady as he pulled open his browser. And there it was. His name. His face. His crimes. Page after page of accusations. Judicial corruption. Racial bias. Bribery. Cases dismissed under suspicious circumstances. Every dark little secret he had tucked away was now staring back at him in black and white. His breath caught. He tried to call one of his usual connections, someone who had helped him smooth over minor scandals in the past. The line rang. And rang. And then, voicemail. He tried another. Straight to voicemail. Panic crept in. He had always assumed he was untouchable. That no one would dare come for him. But as he scrolled, as he read through the damning evidence Olivia had put into motion, it hit him. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just bad luck. Someone had planned this. Had orchestrated it. His stomach twisted. He could still hear her voice in the back of his mind, calm, steady. "This isn't over." And then, a new headline flashed across the screen. Judge Calloway under formal investigation. Suspension pending review. His blood ran cold. He barely had time to process it before another call came in. This time, from a number he knew he couldn't ignore. He answered, his voice cracking. "Yes. You need to come in. Now." He swallowed hard. It's bad, Richard. Real bad. They have evidence. Enough to," a sharp inhale. "Just get in here. You need to fix this." He ended the call and sat there, staring at the screen, his pulse hammering. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. And the woman he had tried to humiliate? She was about to become the most powerful person in his world. The courthouse that once stood as Richard Calloway's kingdom now felt like a prison. The air was thick with whispers, stolen glances, and silent judgment. Everywhere he walked, he could feel it, the shift, the weight of his name being dragged through the very system he had manipulated for years. His courtroom was no longer his. Each step toward the meeting room felt heavier than the last. The once confident strut, the arrogant posture, all of it was gone. He walked with his head slightly lower, his hands clammy, his breath uneven. The walls, the same polished wood and towering bookshelves that had once radiated his power, now loomed over him, suffocating him. This was no longer a place where he ruled. It was a place where his downfall was unfolding in real time. He reached the double doors, hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then stepped inside. And there she was. Olivia Carter sat at the head of the long conference table, calm, composed, her fingers lightly resting on the stack of documents in front of her. Across from her sat 3 other officials, members of the state's Judicial Review Board. They didn't even acknowledge him as he entered. Not at first. His throat was dry. He forced himself to clear it, then managed a tight, brittle smile. "I assume there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Olivia lifted her eyes, meeting his for the first time since that disastrous day in court. There was no gloating in her expression. No triumph. Just certainty. "Take a seat, Judge Calloway," she said smoothly, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. The way she said it, the control in her voice, it made his stomach turn. He pulled out the chair, his movements stiff, mechanical. He had always been the one calling the shots, the one others feared, the one who dictated how things played out. Now, the power had shifted, and he felt it in every single second that passed. One of the review board members, an older man with graying hair and unreadable eyes, adjusted his glasses. "Judge Calloway, I assume you're aware of why we've called you here." Calloway forced a chuckle. "I've seen the headlines. A series of baseless accusations. If this is about some disgruntled attorney trying to smear my name, then enough." Olivia's voice cut through the room like a blade. Sharp. Final. The tension thickened. Calloway's mouth shut, and for the first time in his life, he was the one being silenced. Olivia leaned forward, sliding a folder across the table toward him. "You know exactly why you're here," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "The evidence is extensive. Testimonies from attorneys who witnessed your judicial misconduct. Financial records linking you to companies with vested interests in cases you ruled on. Internal communications proving you dismissed legitimate cases based on personal bias. Should I go on?" Calloway's fingers hovered over the folder, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could feel the weight of every person in that room watching him. His mouth was dry when he spoke. "This is ridiculous. I have served this court for years. I have upheld the law, you have twisted the law," Olivia interrupted, her gaze locked on him. "You've manipulated the system to serve people like yourself while crushing those who never stood a chance. But today, that stops." Calloway felt his stomach twist. He forced himself to keep his voice even. "I don't have to sit here and listen to, you do," Olivia said, cutting him off again, this time with such certainty that it stung. "Because the moment you walk out of this room, everything in that folder will be turned over to the Ethics Commission, the state attorney's office, and the press." The room fell into suffocating silence. For the first time since he had stepped inside, Calloway's confidence cracked. Because she wasn't bluffing. His eyes flickered to the review board members. They weren't looking at him with sympathy. They were looking at him like a dead man walking. A cold sweat spread across his back. How had this happened? His mind raced, searching for a way out, for a loophole, for anything that would give him back the control he had lost. But the more he looked at Olivia, the more he realized, there wasn't one. She had built this moment. She had constructed it, layer by layer, piece by piece, until she had him right where she wanted. And now, she was watching him crumble. His fingers trembled as he finally opened the folder. The first page alone made his stomach churn. A list of cases he had dismissed, all with evidence stacked against him. The next page, a bank statement. A deposit from a corporate account directly linked to a ruling he had made in favor of a wealthy developer. The next, an email thread, his own words, his own arrogance, laid bare for everyone to see. His breath hitched. This wasn't just a bad case. This was a death sentence. The silence dragged, stretching the moment. Calloway swallowed hard, forcing his face into something resembling composure. "What do you want?" His voice barely came out. Olivia didn't answer right away. She studied him, letting him sit in his own discomfort. Then, finally, she exhaled and said, "Resign." The word cut through him like a gunshot. His fingers clenched against the pages. He shook his head. "You can't, you will resign, effective immediately," Olivia continued, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And you will issue a public statement admitting to your ethical misconduct." Calloway let out a bitter laugh. "And if I don't?" Olivia leaned back, crossing her arms. "Then everything in that folder becomes public record. Your career will be over, your reputation destroyed, and I guarantee that the next time you see a courtroom, it won't be from behind the bench, it'll be from the defendant's seat." Calloway's jaw clenched. He wanted to fight. Wanted to throw out another insult, another snide remark, anything to reclaim even a fraction of the power he had lost. But deep down, he knew. It was over. There was no deal to be made. No escape route. No favors left to cash in. For the first time in his life, he had no control. His eyes flickered toward the review board members. One of them, the older man who had barely spoken, finally met his gaze and gave the smallest shake of his head. There would be no saving him. Calloway swallowed his pride, though it burned on the way down. He reached for a pen with trembling fingers. And as he signed his name on the resignation letter Olivia had already prepared, he felt it. The weight of everything he had done, collapsing on top of him all at once. When he finished, Olivia took the paper, glancing over it before sliding it into a folder. Then, for the first time since he had walked into the room, she smiled. But it wasn't a gloating smile. It wasn't cruel or mocking. It was the smile of a woman who had finally, after years of fighting, righted a terrible wrong. And Calloway knew, in that moment, that this was the face of the justice he had spent his whole career trying to silence. It had caught up to him. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The weight of the moment pressed against Richard Calloway's chest like an iron fist, suffocating, unrelenting. His hands trembled slightly as he let the pen fall onto the polished wood of the conference table, the ink still fresh on the resignation letter that now marked the end of everything he had built. His signature, once a symbol of power, authority, and control over the lives of others, now stood as nothing more than a surrender. A forced confession of his own corruption. The very room that had once been filled with his voice, his rulings, his unchecked dominance, now swallowed him whole in its crushing silence. He was no longer in charge. He was no longer feared. He was no longer the man he had convinced himself he would always be. He didn't dare lift his eyes just yet. The weight of Olivia Carter's gaze burned into him from across the table, steady, unshaken, filled with an unmistakable certainty that this had always been the inevitable outcome. She had set everything into motion with the precision of a master strategist, laying each piece carefully, waiting for the exact moment when the weight of his own crimes would crush him completely. And now, that moment had arrived. His jaw tightened, his throat dry as he forced himself to look up, to meet her eyes. There was no trace of arrogance in her expression. No smug satisfaction. No triumphant sneer. Just calm, unyielding justice. And somehow, that made it worse. "You think this makes you some kind of savior?" Calloway's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, his usual commanding tone replaced with something weaker, something lost. Olivia didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't shift in her seat. She simply watched him, her gaze unwavering, as if she had already anticipated his response before he had even spoken. Her fingers rested lightly on the stack of damning evidence in front of her, her presence alone making it clear that there was no escaping this. "I didn't come here to be a savior, Calloway," she said, her voice smooth, precise, controlled. "I came here to make things right." Calloway scoffed, though the sound held no real conviction. His grip on the arms of his chair tightened, his nails pressing into the wood as he struggled to maintain any semblance of control over the situation. But there was none. Not anymore. "You ruined me," he muttered, the words bitter, resentful, dripping with disbelief. Olivia exhaled softly, the faintest shake of her head betraying the patience she had learned to cultivate over years of fighting men like him. "No," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "You ruined yourself." The silence in the room became unbearable. The review board members sat still, watching, waiting, their expressions unreadable. There was no sympathy. No concern. No hesitation. Only judgment. Judgment of a man who had spent his life delivering it on to others, but who now found himself on the other side. Calloway swallowed hard, feeling the walls closing in, his carefully constructed facade crumbling piece by piece. "This is a joke," he muttered under his breath, his fingers twitching as he struggled to keep his hands still. "This whole thing. You're making a mistake, a mistake." Olivia repeated, arching a single brow. The sheer absurdity of his words made her laugh, a quiet, humorless sound that cut through the air like a blade. "Calloway, there are over 50 cases in that folder that link you to judicial misconduct, racial bias, and outright corruption. Your financial records alone are enough to send you into an ethics trial before the month is over. And if that's not enough," she tapped a page in the stack of documents, her voice steady, controlled, dangerous, "there are emails. Signed by you. A direct trail of evidence proving exactly how deep your corruption runs. So tell me again. What part of this is a mistake?" Calloway's breath stilled. The room felt colder. The words "emails. Signed by you." Echoed in his mind like a death sentence. His fingers curled into tight fists. His pulse hammered against his temples. He tried desperately, to find something to say, some way to push back, to deny, to discredit, but there was nothing left. She had him. His entire life, his career, his influence, his very identity, had just been stripped away. He let out a shaky breath, running a hand over his face, pressing his fingers against his forehead as if that alone could stop the world from spinning. "I don't have to accept this," he muttered, shaking his head, as if he could force reality to bend in his favor. "I still have connections." "People who, your connections aren't answering your calls," Olivia interrupted, her voice like cold steel. "They cut you loose the second your name hit the news. No one is coming to save you, Calloway. No one is going to help you." He clenched his jaw. "This isn't how it's supposed to end." Olivia leaned back in her chair, studying him, watching the last of his arrogance drain away, leaving nothing but the raw, bitter truth behind. "That's where you're wrong," she said simply. "This is exactly how it was always supposed to end." Another knock at the door. Sharp. Precise. A court officer stepped inside. His presence alone made it clear, Calloway's time in this room was over. "It's time," the officer said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Calloway's entire body stiffened. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to protest, to fight, to do something, but what was there left to do? The battle had already been lost. Slowly, stiffly, he pushed back his chair and stood. Every pair of eyes in the room followed him. Watching. Judging. Dismissing. He had spent years wielding his power over others. Years deciding their fate with the slam of his gavel, treating justice like his personal game. And now? Now, he was nothing. A man stripped of his title. His influence. His control. And the person who had orchestrated it all, the woman he had humiliated, belittled, dismissed as if she were nothing, was the one watching him fall. As he turned toward the door, Olivia spoke, her voice calm, unwavering, final. "Calloway." He stopped. He didn't turn around. "That courtroom isn't yours anymore," she said, her words landing like a hammer. "And it never will be again." The truth of those words sank into his chest like a heavy stone, pressing down, suffocating. His fingers clenched at his sides, his breath coming too fast, too uneven, but he forced himself forward. One step. Then another. And another. When he stepped into the hallway, the whispers hit him first. Dozens of eyes. Attorneys. Clerks. Court staff. All watching. Some shaking their heads. Some murmuring in hushed voices. Some just staring. This wasn't just a resignation. This was a public execution. Calloway quickened his pace, his breath short, his pulse roaring in his ears. He needed to get out. Needed to breathe. Needed to escape the suffocating weight of his downfall. But no matter how far he walked, no matter how fast he moved, he couldn't outrun what had just happened. His career was over. His legacy was destroyed. And the woman he had once tried to humiliate? She had just become the most powerful force in his world. The air outside the courthouse was thick with an intensity that seemed almost alive, buzzing through the crowd of onlookers who had gathered like vultures around a carcass. Reporters, lawyers, clerks, they all knew. They had seen the headlines, had whispered about the corruption, had wondered when, not if, Calloway would fall. And now, they were watching the aftermath unfold right in front of them. Calloway moved quickly through the corridor, his breath uneven, his suit suffocating against his damp skin. His mind was still struggling to process how fast it had all happened. One moment, he was untouchable, a man who dictated fates with the stroke of his pen. The next, he was nothing more than a disgraced relic of a system that had finally, turned against him. His name, once a symbol of power in these halls, was now a stain. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, every step a cruel echo of his downfall. He could feel the stares, the eyes following him, but no one said a word. Not a single voice reached out to defend him, no familiar ally stepped forward to soften the blow. They were letting him rot in the disgrace he had created for himself. And then, as if the weight of it all wasn't enough, he heard her voice. "Quite the walk of shame, isn't it?" He stopped. His body stiffened. Slowly, painfully, he turned. Olivia. She stood near the entrance, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. There was no gloating. No mockery. But there was something in her eyes, something sharp, something unforgiving. "You should get used to it," she continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "It's going to be your life from now on." Calloway felt his throat tighten, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to fight back, wanted to lash out, to throw one final blow, but there was nothing left to hit. No defense, no escape, no power. "You have no idea what you've done," he muttered, his voice barely above a growl. Olivia arched a brow, tilting her head slightly. "Don't I?" His pulse hammered. He knew she had won, knew there was no undoing this, but the bitterness, the sheer injustice of it all, burned through his veins. He had spent years building his career. He had worked his way into the upper echelons of the system, had crafted a reputation of fear and authority, had ruled this place with an iron grip. And now? One woman. One case. One moment. That was all it took to tear it all down. "You think you've changed anything?" he sneered, his voice laced with venom. "You think this is some kind of victory? The system doesn't care about people like you. It never has. It never will. Olivia didn't blink. Didn't move. Didn't break. Maybe you're right, she said, her voice measured, composed. Maybe the system is still broken. Maybe it'll always be. But today, Calloway. She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough to slice through the space between them like a blade. Today, I broke you. The words hit like a hammer. Calloway felt the breath leave his lungs in a slow, shuddering exhale. He wanted to tell himself this was temporary, that he could find a way back, that there was still a move left to make. But deep down, he knew. There wasn't. Because when the system finally decided to cast someone out, it did so permanently. A commotion near the entrance broke the silence, reporters swarming in, cameras flashing, voices rising in a chaotic blend of questions and accusations. Judge Calloway. Do you have a statement on the ethics violations? Is it true that bribes were involved in multiple rulings? Do you plan to appeal the review board's decision? Judge Calloway. Judge Calloway. His stomach twisted. He needed to get out. Without another word, he turned, pushing through the heavy doors and into the outside world, where the real nightmare was waiting for him. The steps of the courthouse, once a place where he had stood as a towering figure of authority, were now a battlefield. The press surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward his face as the questions rained down in a relentless storm. What do you have to say about the allegations? How do you respond to the calls for your arrest? Will you be pleading guilty to corruption charges? Every word felt like a nail hammering into the coffin of his career. He barely heard them anymore, barely registered the chaos around him. All he knew was that he had to leave, had to disappear. A black car was waiting at the curb, his driver, one of the few people still willing to be seen with him. He forced his way through the crowd, shoving past reporters, ducking into the back seat and slamming the door shut behind him. The car pulled away, and for the first time, he allowed himself to breathe. But the relief was short-lived. Because as he looked out the window, as the courthouse faded into the distance, he saw the reality of what had happened. He had spent his entire life building an empire on fear, corruption, and absolute control. And in just a matter of hours, it had all come crashing down. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He hesitated before pulling it out. A notification flashed across the screen. Another headline. Disgraced Judge Calloway faces potential criminal charges following resignation. His grip tightened. Then another. And another. State officials announce investigation into Calloway's financial dealings. Former judge may face disbarment pending further review. Calloway squeezed his eyes shut, exhaling sharply through his nose. He wanted to throw the phone, wanted to shatter the screen, wanted to make it all stop. But there was no stopping this. This wasn't just the end of his career. This was the beginning of something much, much worse. And for the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. Afraid of what came next. Afraid of what it meant to be powerless. Afraid of the consequences that were no longer in his control. And worst of all, afraid of the woman who had just destroyed him. The silence inside the car was suffocating. Calloway sat rigid in the back seat, his fingers twitching against his knee, his breath coming in slow, uneven bursts as the weight of everything crushed down on him. The driver didn't speak, didn't even glance at him through the rearview mirror. There was no, "Sir, where to?" No acknowledgement. Just the dull hum of the engine and the distant noise of a city that was already moving past him, already adjusting to a world where Richard Calloway was no longer a judge. His phone kept buzzing. Each vibration was a pulse of dread, a reminder that his name was everywhere now. Every news outlet, every social media post, every conversation in the legal world. He had become a headline. A cautionary tale. The man who had once dictated fates with a single ruling was now at the mercy of a system he had twisted in his favor for years. And the irony of it all was unbearable. His fingers clenched around the phone, but he didn't unlock it. He couldn't. He already knew what was waiting for him. Statements from politicians distancing themselves. Former allies making half-hearted condemnations. The ethics board formally stripping him of his authority. Calls for a deeper investigation, for criminal charges, for real consequences. He let out a slow breath, his gaze shifting to the window. The city blurred past him, but it felt alien now. He had walked these streets as if he owned them, had walked into courtrooms with the certainty that no one could ever challenge him. But now he was just another man running from a fate he could no longer control. The driver finally spoke, his voice neutral, detached. "Where do you want to go, sir?" For a moment, Calloway had no answer. Where could he go? The courthouse was no longer his domain. His office would be emptied out before the day was over. His home, would it even feel like home anymore? Then, without thinking, the words slipped out. "Take me to the club." The driver hesitated. A beat too long. Then, with a quiet nod, the car veered left, merging onto a quieter street. The club had been his sanctuary for years. A high-end, exclusive members-only retreat where men like him, judges, lawyers, CEOs, politicians, gathered in private rooms with expensive whiskey and the certainty that the world outside couldn't touch them. Calloway had sealed deals there. Had shaped rulings, had decided fates over cigars and laughter. He needed to be around people who understood. People who still respected him. But when the car pulled up to the discreet entrance, something felt off. The usual doorman, a man who had greeted him with deference for years, didn't move to open the door. Instead, he simply stood there, his expression unreadable. Calloway pushed the door open himself, stepping out into the cool air, adjusting his suit jacket as he strode forward. The doorman didn't speak. Didn't even make eye contact. A bad sign. Inside, the lobby was quieter than usual. The receptionist, a woman who had always greeted him with a warm, rehearsed smile, barely looked up. He could feel it, the shift. He straightened his shoulders, pushing past the feeling, moving toward the lounge. He needed a drink. Needed something to ground him. Then he saw them. A cluster of men in one of the private seating areas, deep in conversation, men he had once considered allies, men who had benefited from his rulings, from his connections. They were talking, laughing, but the second they spotted him, the atmosphere changed. The laughter died. Eyes darted toward him, then away, as if he was something to be avoided. He approached, forcing a smirk, trying to grasp at the last shred of control he had left. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you all so soon," he said, lowering himself into an empty seat. A heavy silence settled over the group. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked toward their drinks. Finally, one of them, an older man, *** a Judge Calloway had once mentored, *** cleared his throat. "Richard. I don't think you should be here." Calloway's smirk faltered. "Excuse me. You need to lay low," another voice cut in, this one sharper. "This whole thing, people are watching. This isn't good for anyone." He felt the words like a slap. Not good for anyone. Not good for them. They weren't concerned about him. They were concerned about the optics. He let out a dry, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You're all acting like this is over. Like I'm finished." His voice dipped lower, tighter. "You really think I'm just going to sit back and let them take everything from me?" The older judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "Richard, it's already gone." Calloway's breath stilled. The truth of those words sat between them, undeniable. "Best thing you can do is disappear for a while," another voice muttered. "Let it blow over. Maybe in a few years, if people forget, Calloway shot up from his seat, the chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. Forget? His voice was sharp, filled with disbelief. I built this place. I built this city's legal system. No, the older judge interrupted, his voice firmer now. The system existed long before you, Richard. And it'll exist long after. Calloway felt the world tilt, his vision narrowing. They had already moved on. The men he had once ruled beside, the men who had shaken his hand and toasted to their victories, they were already erasing him. He turned without another word, storming out of the lounge, the whispers chasing after him. Outside, the air felt heavier. Colder. His driver was still waiting, but Calloway barely noticed. His mind spun, searching for an answer, a next move, a way out. Then, as if fate wasn't finished with him yet, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a news alert. It was a message. From an unknown number. He hesitated, then opened it. You should watch your back. The breath left his lungs. His fingers tightened around the phone. Then another message came through. This isn't just about your career anymore. His pulse roared in his ears. He looked up, eyes scanning the quiet street. For the first time, in a very, very long time, Richard Calloway felt fear. The streetlights flickered, casting elongated shadows against the damp pavement. The night felt different, heavier, charged with something Calloway couldn't name but could feel sinking into his bones. His fingers gripped his phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white, the words on the screen burning into his mind. You should watch your back. This isn't just about your career anymore. He swallowed hard, scanning the street. The usual sense of control, the certainty that he was the one untouchable, had long since evaporated. Now, for the first time in his life, he felt vulnerable. Exposed. Hunted. His breathing was shallow as he turned, his gaze sweeping across the sidewalk, searching. Nothing but the hum of the city, the distant sound of tires against wet asphalt, a few pedestrians lost in their own worlds. But the paranoia had already settled in, curling around his spine. Was someone watching him? Had someone been following him? He took a slow step back toward the car, his muscles tense, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. His driver was still waiting, unmoving, staring ahead as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Calloway yanked open the car door, slid inside, and slammed it shut with a force that rattled the frame. His driver didn't turn. Didn't ask questions. Smart man. Take me home, Calloway muttered, his voice hoarse. The car pulled away, the tires gliding smoothly over the pavement, but Calloway's mind was anything but smooth. Who sent the message? Was it Olivia? The press? Someone from the review board? Or, was it someone worse? He had made enemies before. Plenty of them. He had crushed careers, destroyed reputations, thrown men behind bars without a second thought. He had ruled with an iron fist because he could. But now, he was the one on the other side. And the realization tasted like acid. The city blurred past him through the tinted windows, neon lights reflecting against the glass. The messages stayed on his screen, their presence a taunt, a warning, a promise. By the time the car pulled into the driveway of his estate, a sprawling, gated property that had once symbolized his success, his power, his permanence, he felt no relief. The gates opened mechanically, but they didn't offer protection. Not anymore. The house was dark except for the dim glow of the porch lights. He stepped out, the wind cutting against his face as the car pulled away behind him. His fingers twitched toward his phone again, as if expecting another message, another reminder that his world was no longer under his control. He moved quickly up the steps, unlocking the door with hands that felt colder than they should. Inside, the silence was deafening. The space that had once been a sanctuary, polished floors, towering bookshelves, grand furniture, felt empty. He locked the door behind him, flipping the deadbolt, then checked it again. And again. The paranoia wouldn't leave. He poured himself a drink, something dark and expensive, something that once made him feel invincible. But tonight, the burn in his throat felt like a punishment rather than a comfort. His mind circled back to the message. This isn't just about your career anymore. His career was already gone. So what the hell else was left to take? Then, a noise. A small, almost imperceptible sound. A shift. A creak in the silence. His blood ran cold. He wasn't alone. His grip on the glass tightened, his breath stilling as he turned his head slowly toward the hallway. The shadows were thick, unmoving. But something was there. He put the drink down carefully, his movements controlled, deliberate. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stepped forward, his senses sharp, wired, alert. Who's there? His voice was low, but firm. Silence. A trick of his imagination? The stress getting to him? Or, another sound? Closer this time. His fingers twitched toward the nearest drawer, the one in the hallway table where he kept a gun. A precaution. A habit. He moved toward it, slow, steady. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against him like a weight. The handle was cool beneath his fingertips as he pulled it open, reaching inside, and then, a voice. Calm. Controlled. You've always been the kind of man who thought power made you safe. The sound shattered him. His spine locked, his breath hitched. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. He turned sharply, and there she was. Olivia. She stood in the dim light of the hallway, her posture calm, unshaken, certain. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with something he couldn't name but knew was dangerous. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating. She wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't a courtroom. This wasn't her world. This was his home. And yet, she was standing there like she had always belonged. Calloway forced himself to steady his voice, to push back the overwhelming disbelief, the unease, the growing fear. You have no right to be here. Olivia took a step forward, slow, measured. Neither did justice in your courtroom. But that never stopped you, did it? His grip on the drawer handle tightened. This is trespassing. I could have you arrested. A slow smile. Cold. Knowing. By who? The question landed like a hammer. The police? The same police who had already begun distancing themselves from him. The same system that was already tearing him apart. Who the hell could he even call? His throat felt dry. His mind raced. She wasn't here to talk. What do you want? His voice came out rough, stripped of its usual authority. Olivia studied him for a long moment. Too long. Then she exhaled, tilting her head slightly. I wanted to see it, she murmured. The moment it finally hit you. His pulse slowed. A realization crawled into his skin. What? The moment you realize what it feels like to have no power. A cold, sickening silence. His heart pounded too loud, too fast. She smiled again, but it wasn't a smile. It was a sentence. Welcome to the other side of the bench, Calloway. The world tilted. Everything, the power, the control, the dominance he had wielded so effortlessly, was gone. And she was standing there, watching him crumble. Watching him break. He had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. But now, in his own home, in his own space, with nothing left to hide behind, he finally understood what it meant to be powerless. Calloway stood frozen, his breath shallow, his grip still tight on the drawer handle as Olivia's words settled into the air between them, thick and inescapable. The weight of it was unbearable. He had spent years holding the gavel, delivering judgment without hesitation, shaping fates as if he were above consequence. But now, stripped of everything, his title, his reputation, his power, he was nothing more than another man brought to his knees by the very system he had corrupted. And Olivia? She was the force that had done what no one else dared. She took a slow step forward, her gaze never wavering. "You thought you owned the law," she murmured, her voice calm, deliberate. "But the law was never yours. You twisted it. Abused it. You treated justice like your personal weapon. And now, you finally understand what it feels like to be on the other side." Calloway's stomach twisted, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The room, once a symbol of his success, now felt suffocating, the walls closing in. He had always believed himself untouchable, beyond the reach of those he trampled over. But Olivia had proven him wrong. He had laughed at her in that courtroom, mocked her presence, dismissed her as insignificant. Now, she was standing in his home, holding his fate in her hands. "You should leave," he forced out, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "You got what you wanted." A slow, knowing smile flickered at the corner of Olivia's lips. "Not yet." She reached into her bag, pulled out a thin envelope, and placed it carefully on the table between them. "This is your final ruling, Calloway." His fingers twitched, but he didn't reach for it. She watched him for a long moment, as if memorizing the sight of him at his lowest. Then, with one last glance, she turned and walked toward the door. No more words. No parting threats. Just quiet, measured steps as she left the house, the air shifting in her wake. Calloway stood there for what felt like hours before he finally moved. His hands trembled as he picked up the envelope, breaking the seal with slow, hesitant fingers. Inside was a formal notice. The final nail in his coffin. His law license had been permanently revoked. Any hope of redemption, of clawing his way back into relevance, was gone. His breath came out in a slow, ragged exhale. He had lost everything. His career. His influence. His allies. And now, the one thing that defined him, the ability to wield power over others, had been taken away permanently. The weight of it hit him all at once. He was no longer Judge Richard Calloway. He was just Richard. Days passed in a blur, but the world outside moved on without him. His name faded from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals, fresher controversies. The people he had once ruled over no longer spoke of him. His calls went unanswered. His presence in the legal world had been erased as if he had never existed. And the silence, the absence of fear, of reverence, of importance, was more unbearable than anything else. Meanwhile, Olivia's career soared. The case against Calloway had solidified her reputation, and doors that had once been closed to her now swung wide open. She took on bigger cases, dismantled more systems of corruption, and became a name that carried weight, respect, and power. But unlike Calloway, she wielded that power with purpose. She didn't forget what had been done to her in that courtroom. She didn't forget the way he had mocked her, the way he had tried to humiliate her. But she also knew that true justice wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. About restoring what had been broken. And that's exactly what she had done. Justice had finally been served. Now, let's take a moment to reflect on everything that just unfolded. How many times have we seen people in power believe they are untouchable? How many times has justice been twisted, manipulated, used against the very people it was meant to protect? But in the end, the truth always finds its way to the surface. No matter how long someone gets away with corruption, the fall always comes. And when it does, it comes hard. Olivia's story is one of perseverance, resilience, and undeniable strength. She didn't just fight for herself, she fought for every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, and told they didn't belong. And in the end, she won. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she demanded justice. And Calloway? His fate is a lesson in what happens when arrogance blinds a person to their own downfall. He believed the system would always protect him, that his power would never fade. But power isn't permanent. It belongs to those who fight for it, who respect it, who understand that justice is bigger than any one person. So now, I ask you, what did you take away from this story? Do you believe Calloway got what he deserved? Or do you think redemption was possible for him? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales filled with twists, lessons, and justice, subscribe to Tales of Twist now. Your support helps bring more powerful stories to life. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.